Let's go to one specific geographic location that I know each of us has recent experience. Each of us, in a different way, has spent a lot of time in the Gulf of Mexico in the last year plus. I went in July of 2008. I wanted to make a film about the relationship between man and the sea in the United States. We hadn't done that in a decade. And I chose Louisiana because everyone in Louisiana has a relationship with water. Rivers, creeks, bayous, swamps, the Gulf of Mexico, the Mississippi River. And they love their water. They love their culture. It's the most unique state of all the 50. I can argue that for hours if you'd like. We arrived in July of 2008, and the very next day, a barge on the Mississippi River T-boned another barge and spilled 400,000 gallons of oil into the Mississippi. And we called the head of the DEQ down there at the Department of Environmental Quality, and he said, "Oh, well, you'd like to talk to me on film?" We said, "Yeah, that'd be great." And we said, "Where should we meet you?" He said, "Well, we have this spill going on. Why don't we just do it in front of the spill?" Okay, fine. You know, this is a government guy. He's not, because they're so used to spills in that part of the world that, it's kind of business as usual. And we spent the next 2 years going back and forth from Louisiana talking to people about the environmental ills regarding water. And as we were finishing the film in April of 2010, the Deepwater Horizon exploded and sank, etc. So we stopped finishing the film, went back down, opened it back up. So for the last 9 months or so, I've been traveling around the country showing the film Sola. And, at the time, you remember when that spill was ongoing, and every time you turned on a TV or walked by a bar or a restaurant, everyone was talking about it. Everyone talked about what a horrific thing this was. And eventually it was capped, and now we're dealing with what will be a long-term study of how that spill and the attempts to clean it up will change that part of the world forever. But I've challenged the film we made is because of the subject matter is slightly emotional, and because it ends with the spill, it tends to provoke lots of kind of sadness and anger, etc. But I challenge the audiences everywhere we go, because I want to know what, and I'm going to challenge you now, even though you haven't seen the film. That we all agree that was a horrific thing that happened in the Gulf. Carl's written a beautiful book recently about the whole mess. David's been down there working with Vietnamese on aquaculture, land-based aquaculture projects. There's a lot of stuff going on there. But my challenge is, what have you done individually since April 20th of 2010 to change your lives so that we'll be less dependent upon the oil that comes out of the Gulf? Because the way our film concludes is that these guys, this is not a charity these guys are running out there. They're drilling mile, 2 miles, 3 miles below the surface, and it's very expensive to do that. But they're doing it because they make money. And the reason they make money is because we're addicted to oil, and we are having a very hard time changing. So I don't really want an answer, but I want you to think about that. What have you done personally to change your lives so that we'll become less dependent upon fossil fuels, so that they won't be able to make as much money and they won't drill? Again, these guys have different experiences, different and similar experiences in the Gulf. Maybe we just talk about that for a little while.
I've been spending a good deal of my career, my later career, in the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of it thanks to Sylvia Earle, piloting little submarines and going down and discovering that the Gulf of Mexico is quite extraordinary. It is not at all what the public perception of the Gulf is. I think the public perception is this overheated brown shallow body of water where oil spills and hurricanes come from. And the reality is, I was down 250 feet sitting on the bottom in a little sub, and I looked up through the dome and I could see waves breaking on the surface. I've never seen clearer water anywhere in the world. And corals living down there because there's so much light. Amazing corals formations and amazing, rich, diverse communities, including those really cool grouper I was talking about earlier, digging big holes and all sorts of cool stuff. So it's important, I think, to think of the Gulf as that. The Deepwater Horizon episode, like many of us, drew us to the area like moths to a light bulb, and I was one of those moths. I went down there without a clear idea of why I was going, but I just knew I had to be there, and I just met with people. I went out, I did some sampling, and met with the Vietnamese community, and realized that this is a community that's been terribly hard hit by this oil spill. Most of them lost their homes in Katrina, and this was after 30 years ago, losing everything and after the fall of Saigon and coming here for refuge. Most of that population lives below the poverty line. 44% of the boats on the Gulf of Mexico are owned by individuals with Vietnamese surnames. They make a huge part of the fishing industry, about 20% of the fishing industry. They don't want to fish anymore. They don't believe that the fishing is safe, but they desperately want their kids to stay in New Orleans East. But they're leaving because there aren't opportunities. So we launched a project to introduce land-based recirculating aquaculture systems that recirculate 99% of their water, no chemicals or antibiotics. It's the most sustainable form of aquaculture on the planet, and to keep them in the seafood industry, but to do it sustainably and basically create a new economy in that region. It's something that I'm excited about. The other thing is just a very strange twist of irony. You know, I've been working in Cuba for the last 11 years. Their Gulf of Mexico is awesome. I saw the most incredibly huge stands of Acropora palmata, elkhorn coral, which is 95% gone from the Caribbean now. But this is big, big elkhorn coral, incredible. Just 90 miles from the Florida Keys, where corals have pretty much, 60% I think has died over the last couple of decades. And when we heard that Cuba was planning to drill for oil, a lot of politicians got very upset and running around and proposing different sorts of legislation to punish any international companies that would dare help Cuba do this. Well, it turns out that it was our oil spill that threatened Cuba, because early on, that oil was heading south and right for those magnificent corals. So we actually held meetings here in DC, working with the U.S. interest section in Havana and the State Department here, trying to figure out what the hell are we going to do if this oil reaches Cuba? Because after 50 years of a policy of isolation, nobody knows anybody. So we found that the marine biologists were probably in the best position, because we actually had a network, to help build those bridges. But it's a lesson, I think, that the Gulf is an international body of water, Cuba, Mexico, and the US. And the one thing that I definitely took notice of in the Oil Spill Commission report is the Commission's finding that we have to work with Cuba and Mexico to develop international drilling standards, because when Cuba drills, and they will, it's going to be in a well that's deeper than the Deepwater horizon.
And I'll let Carl speak to this, but the worst day in the Gulf of late was April 23rd of this year, because the people in the Gulf really think that once that 1-year anniversary of the spill happened, that the world's attention, given all the other natural and man-made disasters around the world, will turn away and it won't come back. I mean, do you think we'll be able to stay focused on the Gulf long enough to watch it change?
Well, on April 23rd, my book about the Gulf was only 4 days old, so hopefully people's attention will be a little longer than that. But that's obviously a huge problem. It was a problem for anybody who was trying to talk about that event or look forward. Is the people down there really were sure that they would simply be abandoned. They were sure of a lot of things, some of which luckily have not turned out to be as bad as people feared. But to the question of what we've done individually since then, I just want to share a little personal experience. When the Exxon Valdez ran aground, I was not working as a marine conservationist. I was studying seabirds. And I remember quite clearly, I was sitting at my desk and I was writing something, and All Things Considered came on the radio, and that was the lead story. I had never been to Alaska, but Alaska was one of those inspiring things that was out there drawing me, like Jacques Cousteau was out there drawing us for all of those formative years. And I heard this story about this ship running aground and all the oil that was running. And one of my most formative images was seeing an oiled cormorant on television after the Santa Barbara oil blowout when I was in my early teens. I still remember very vividly, I can see that image in my mind of that bird struggling in that oil. And it was one of those things that just slightly changed the trajectory of my thinking in my life. And here was this much bigger event in an area, in a confined area, packed with wildlife. And they began talking immediately about all the animals that were struggling in this spreading oil slick. I heard about 30 seconds of that newscast, and I burst into tears at my keyboard, sobbing. Because, among other things, I thought it was terrible, but also the emotion of the frustration of being able to do absolutely nothing at all about it. And then fast forward these decades to April 20th of 2010, a similar thing, and my reaction then was one of anger, instant anger that we had learned nothing, because it became immediately apparent that there was a total lack of preparedness to deal with this event. And I got very angry right away. But then that second emotion kicked back in of, I can do nothing about this. I'm completely powerless. But then I reminded myself that I was no longer the person who only studied seabirds. I was this professional marine conservationist, and I had declared that it was my job to do something about things like this. Well, that was terrible because I had no idea what I could possibly do or say. And when you don't know what you can possibly do or say, you can always revert to your blog. So I wrote something about it on my blog thinking, how lame is this? And before I got to the Gulf, which I went about a week later, because I thought I needed to see things at this point. I had done so much writing, I didn't want to just listen to the radio or watch TV. I wanted to see things for myself. I know that the impression that the media gets and gives is not always the same impression I would get. I knew that I have an eye for wildlife that most of the media doesn't have. It was the middle of the migration season. I wanted to see what was happening with shorebirds coming across the Gulf and things like that. But before I even went there and started writing or saying anything based on what I had actually seen, based on my blog and a few photos that I put on my blog. I guess that was at the end of my first trip to the Gulf. I had some photos. So 2 blog entries, one with photos, and I got asked to come to a congressional hearing on the subject. And that started to snowball really incredibly, because I was on my way home on the Amtrak train, just going up to New York after the hearing, and a friend of mine called me from California saying, do you know you're on MSNBC right now? And I said, what are you talking about? I'm on the train right now. And he said, no, you were at some hearing or something today? And I said, oh yeah, that's on television? Okay. And then I got called the next day to do another TV show, and then I got called to do another thing on PBS on TV. It's too easy to think at the beginning, oh, I just can't. Because we all think that. But if you say, oh, I just will, it's surprising what happens.
Carl's last piece of advice is buy a bigger flashlight.
Buy a bigger flashlight, yes. I do have these products I create. You know, I did have this book about the oil blowout that just came out. That's an angry book. There's a lot to be angry about. There's also a lot toward the end to be hopeful about. I think the big problems with the blowout are the big problems with the Gulf and the big problems with oil have nothing to do with the blowout, really. They began before that. The big problem with oil is the oil we burn, not the oil we spill. I had a book that came out in January called The View from Lazy Point. That was a labor of love and is about the relationship we declare with the natural world around us, and is intended to be very uplifting. And we have a new TV series called Saving the Ocean that is entirely about solutions and is airing on about 85 PBS stations. And hopefully we'll get more stations and we'll make more episodes as time goes on. So as far as positive things and solutions, those are the things I have on offer.
I'm going to thank David and Carl Celine for inspiration, WRI for hosting us.